Let's face it, parenting is the most important job on earth. Every day presents a stack of different challenges, and more often than not, the answer is outside of the box. On this podcast, we will offer proven strategies, interview pioneers in education, give insights into how to be successful parents, and even share our imperfect experiences of being parents ourselves. We're all in on this journey, and we will span the globe to find out what is working and who has the answers. This is the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast. Here are your hosts, Darren McCarthy and Brian Powers.
Welcome to the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast. I'm Brian Powers.
And I'm Darren McCarthy.
And today we have on our podcast, she's been on our podcast before, a good friend, Gayle Moyers, and we are talking about the brain.
Yeah, I asked Gail to come back because I remember she did a lecture back in 1998 at the San Diego State University, and she talked about something called the Triune Brain, which at the time I thought, like, what in the heck is that? But the more she talked about it, the more I realized how important it is for parents and professionals to understand how the brain works. And this theory is a really simple theory of breaking it down from to three parts. And she'll get into the weeds on this pretty well. But I think you had a pretty good understanding after she was done, right?
I like the fact that she basically said you don't have to be a neurologist or a brain surgeon to understand the brain. The other big thing was, I think before we got on, I really said to her, could we talk in a novice sense on understanding this? And she really knocked it out of the park because she, as usual, in typical Gayle Moyers fashion, she left us with multiple golden nuggets to take away. But, just saying that it's sometimes I make this joke because I'm a lefty and I say, we're the only people on the right side of our minds. But she said it's not about one side or the other. And when it comes to reading comprehension or comprehension in general, there's roadblocks that can be moved.
But you could it gets really confusing for parents because one of the words that you'll see a lot is bilateral integration.
Okay. And
exactly what Gail's talking about is both sides of the brain. So, we will always say that professionals are trained to utilize language that describes the issue. But in the same light, the language that they use to describe the issue is confusing.
Correct.
So, even using a term like triune brain, well, we know tri means three, right? But then you say, put that word together with brain, and you're kind of like, what in the world are we going to talk about today? And then she starts to break down, she uses the word evolution, and ultimately we're talking about the evolution of the brain, and that the brain has ultimately parts in this theory.
Yeah, she makes a comparison to building or to a house or a foundation, the house and the roof. And, that kind of put it in perspective. And the fact that, most children are in that flight or fight mode, that they have a reactive brain more than a thinking brain. And that's no surprise. I mean, we both talk about our kids and home life. And I often, especially when it comes to homework, I think you talk about in this episode, the kids can be in that fight or flight mode.
Yeah, and how that translates to a parent is you kind of have to know where they are in order to find the right tools and methods to take them to where they need to be. So understanding the brain and kind of what facet, when she talks about fight or flight, that goes into that whole conversation of attention versus anxiety, which I think ultimately will be a really good series of podcasts. Just what they want to get out of this is where is my child kind of right now? What part of the brain are they kind of focused in, and how do we get them where they need to be with pragmatic type stuff you can use at home? So let's listen in on the podcast with Gail and take it from there. And we just love having her. She's such a joy with great energy, and she always brings a bunch of little resources to the plate. And we've written them down. They're part of the show notes. There's something you can go back to later on. And here we go with Gayle Moyers.
3, 2, 1. Welcome to the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast. I'm Brian Powers.
I'm Darren McCarthy.
And we're joined today by our good friend, and you've heard her before on our other podcast, and she is a wealth of knowledge, Gayle Moyers, learning expert with many years of expertise. And we're here today. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what we're going to talk about, Gail?
Well, I think one of the things we want to talk about is the brain, because the brain is the thinking part of our human being. And but you can't have a brain without a body, and you can't have a body without a brain. So we're going to talk a little bit about how the brain becomes a part of successful learning, and what are the roadblocks that might be helpful to teachers and parents.
Okay. Right. One of the things that we always come across is that as soon as an educator, especially with someone with your background, Gail, starts to talk about the brain, the average person starts to their eyes kind of fall out of their head, and they can't think about how to take it all in. So the reason we wanted to hit this topic is because I know you explain it in a very kind of clear, concise manner that they can walk away with and start to utilize.
Well, thank you. I did that so I wouldn't have to learn all the nerve names.
Smart.
and the brain part. Because right. I know the concept that we need as parents and people working with children is very simple. And it's kind of like building a house in my mind. You have to have a foundation before you can put up the walls and put a roof over it. And we've heard a lot about the two-sided brain. So like the front and back of the house, or the left and right of the house, that kind of thing. That's not as relevant. And if I could just take a minute, I'd like to speak to that, because everybody says it's about right side, left side. But we want you to think about it in a different way today. What Santa Barbara found out when I was finishing college in the late 60s, early 60s I finished, but the research there was showing that good learners did not have a dominant right or a dominant left. They were able to access the side needed for the task at hand.
Interesting.
And I think
why is that important, the dominance?
Well, because if we're talking about, say, for instance, imagery, then you want the student, say, for instance, you hear the word dog, D-O-G. Okay, that dog goes into the left side of the brain, D-O-G. However, the concept of dog, because the brain is picturing a waggy tail, big ears, and a dog trotting across the street through the cars, that's right side. And so you need both. You have to learn the word dog, and then you have to learn, well, what does he look like and how does he function? And they work together. And people think that's where comprehension happens. However, there are so many roadblocks that are easy to move out of the way today. And I'd like to get to that after we build our foundation, our middle, and our upper part of the house.
And you're not just talking about reading comprehension. You're talking about comprehension of language and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah, even if you're reading a picture storybook, can you get meaning from the pictures? Can you put language on the pictures?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
So
okay.
It isn't about reading. In fact, it's more about listening. So when you're reading, say you're reading a wordless book, because there are plenty of good ones out there, then can you tell the story of what the pictures are saying? And that's kind of a readiness skill for reading, because if you put the words with the pictures, they match up. Does that make sense?
It does almost make that interpretation. So when our children are younger, or we were younger, we really didn't. We got wordless books. So being able to say what's going on the pages is pretty much a basic function.
Yes, absolutely. To put the pictures into words that mean what the pictures say. Right.
Okay. That's a good lead into this concept of the brain that you were talking about.
Yes. And there was in Stephanie Merritt's book, Mind, Music, and Imagery, which I highly recommend to parents and professionals. That book actually became one of my teaching Bibles when I got hooked on music. But in that concept, she brings us to this concept of Paul MacLean's theory. Paul MacLean thought that our brain develops as it did hierarchically in, what would they say, survival, the different animals.
Yeah.
So you have like the reptilian brain, the most simple, basic brain. And that's the bottom layer. And so the reptile brain or the reptilian brain is all about survival. And we know it as fight or flight. So, for example, if you're in the mode of survival and you instinctively run up to a guy with a gun and hit him and he shoots your foot, then afterwards you say, that was stupid. Why did I do that? Well, because you weren't up to your thinking brain yet at that moment. You were in a reactive brain, not a thinking brain. Okay? Mm-hmm. And you can't know how often the kids are caught in this reptilian brain, this lower level brain. And the other part of it is then you have to climb through the midbrain, which they I think of it as the intuition. It's called the mammalian brain because we don't think lizards have feelings, right?
Right.
And we know that, for instance, monkeys and I have a dog, so my dog is just as good as a monkey. But, they get concepts, they get voice or they get voice tone. But the mammalian brain is where we access feelings, emotions, intuition, and creativity. And we don't just access all that there, but that's critical. So we have to survive, and then we have to get in touch with our feeling, sensing brain, which he calls the mammalian brain. And only then can you get up to what we call the neocognitive brain, or that's the thinking brain. So that's where we surpass the monkeys. And developmentally, when the child is developing and progressing through his development, McLean thinks that that's the way we develop, that it's like through evolution. And I like to remind people, evolution isn't anti-Christian or anti-religion or cold hard science or anything. Some people have an emotional reaction to the word evolution. I don't. It explains everything to me when kids get stuck. And Chilton Pierce, in his book, The Magical Child, where he's talking about how kids can think and be creative, he says that this middle brain, this emotional and intuition is a big part of this. This middle brain is the mortar between the upper and the lower. It's like the mortar between the bricks. How's that registering for you?
It definitely it registers, and it shows that the kind of you're explaining the kind of three levels and bring it down to an understand a basic, like we talked about before we got on the podcast, a novice level.
Okay, that's all we need. Okay. That's good. And you can always assume that the students of today, the children of today, are more caught in stress and anxiety than we ever give them credit for.
How does that translate to the brain and the fight or flight piece?
So exactly. So when you have, I've had several students. Let me add a little thing in right here. There was a book that's out of print now, but it's called The Imagined and the Real. And this is an important thing to understand. The Imagined and the Real was written by Progoff. And what he states in his book, and we know is true now, is that it doesn't matter if you're imagining, say, floating on a wonderful boogie board in the warm Pacific Ocean, or if you're in the warm Pacific Ocean on your boogie board. They make no difference into how the body is going to respond to those thinkings. It's like when you go to the dentist and they're drilling in your teeth. I always pretend I'm in the Pacific Ocean floating on my boogie board. And then I'm not thinking about, is he going to hurt me? It delays my fears. It suppresses them. And you can do that. And I've actually cured test anxiety with that very concept. And I access that midbrain, that intuitive, creative brain. Actually, I do it through music, believe it or not, because the music goes directly to that midbrain. So you can take a person that's highly anxious and put them on a certain melody, a certain cadence with certain calming instruments, and you can take them out of fear and anxiety, and then they will access their midbrain and their upper brain, their neocognitive.
So when you that whole concept of it being hierarchical, we're also talking about developmental hierarchy. So
yes,
really it comes down
thing,
to physical, social, emotional, and cognitive, which we always talk about.
Yeah. And so you guys are thinking now, listening and accumulating what we're saying, and then analyzing it, which is in the neocognitive top brain, because you don't have any static or roadblocks in your lower brain or in your midbrain.
Mm-hmm.
And so students can be shut down emotionally. They can be, they're not worried too much about safety or this or that, but they left the house today with mom and dad fighting and complaining about them or something. And if they emotionally block that away, they're not going to be present for learning in the classroom. It's simple. Isn't that interesting?
Very.
So what's the expectation for when parents take in these three levels, right? So now I understand that there's three parts of the brain. Okay, great. What's the expectation what do they do with this new knowledge? How is it practical?
Well, first off, let's assume that every kid wants to learn, every kid wants to succeed, every kid wants to please his parents. And most of all, every kid is smart enough. So there's no problem with the kid. There may be static or roadblocks in his tri-level brain. So every kid, in my mind, this is the way I work. If I were that kid, I would be behaving just like him. Now, sometimes, because, I'm a very dumb parent. God, I wish I could do that all over again. And it's easy as kind of like an inexperienced parent to do the wrong thing. So the kid has a temper tantrum in the store, and so then we say, well, if you can be quiet, I'll get you a lollipop before we go home. Well, that got rewarded, didn't it? Let's have another temper tantrum when I want something else.
Makes sense.
So all behavior it pays off. So if the kid has a temper tantrum and you don't even roll your eyes or stiffen up your shoulders or anything, you just think, okay, there he goes again. I wonder how long it's going to last. Well,
translate what you're saying to my reality with my kids. And I can learn to say, you know what, they're in fight or flight right now, which means that's it. And I saw, like last night was a perfect example, right? So the kids had a long day, and I didn't come home from work till later, so it kind of stretches the night out. And so they were doing homework probably an hour later than they normally do homework. And this kind of, there was a real good battle going on, and it was because homework is getting a little bit harder. My son's in 5th, my daughter's in 3rd. Homework's getting it takes a little bit more time and effort. And when you start to stretch it into those later hours, you can see that kind of fight or flight, the anxiety kind of stretch longer.
Yeah.
So I almost I have this thing, because I've been doing this for a while. I can see that they're in fight or flight, and I translate it in what is it called? The same thing happens when you stay too long at a friend's house.
Mm-hmm.
And so I call it the 7th inning, right? So the 7th inning is when your pitcher's doing really well in baseball, and you can put him in for one more inning, and the whole game could blow up, or you could pull him out now. And so it's the 7th inning is when the kid is in the fight or flight, and you've got to kind of get them out of that moment. And so that's kind of when I was asking you to kind of translate what these three layers of the brain are and how it pertains to parenting. That's how I translate. I can see that the kid's in fight or flight, and try to take them out of that, or at least out of the environment, or whatever it is, to get out of that moment. Because what you're trying to accomplish is actually hierarchical.
And take a time out. Take a time out, but make it fun.
Take a time out. Yeah.
You've nailed it, because probably it's late. What do you think the kid's going to be worried about? Getting the homework done. It's too much to get done, and he's too tired.
Absolutely.
And I often say, be realistic. What do you and I do when we, I'm working on a project right now that I just want to get it done. And, you have to do it. I say, what is it I say? Something, don't worry, or something like that.
Yeah. But
you're either going to do it and do it well, like a piano. You've got to do 30 minutes of piano practicing. And if you hear your child having a bad day, say, you know what? Let's just take today off. And like I would do that if I weren't playing very well today. And then I would see if I could do better tomorrow.
Yeah, sometimes that battle just continues to keep them in that fight or flight stage. I think we all got that concept of the fight or flight and the first level of the brain, the reptilian piece. Then as we move into the second one, can you kind of think of an example where the child's kind of lingering in that stage and what to do there, and it's not a matter of always taking them out of a certain stage. Fight or flight is the great inhibitor, so that's why we talk about that one. But the second tier of the brain.
And the second tier is, they need to be, this is why music is such a powerful tool. If you can get, for example, Advanced Brain Technologies has that Sound Health series, and there's a concentration one, there's a relaxed one, that's a tensing, but I can guarantee you that talking to a kid that isn't tuned in to what he needs to be in his brain, talking won't do it. It'll make it worse. So you have to deflect.
No, and I find in our house, especially with my oldest, if I allow him to put headphones on and do his work, he'll concentrate a lot better. And
that's perfect.
And I find it with myself too. So putting on headphones with some music really will bring the focus back.
And keep in mind that in the 50s, Lazanov over in Bulgaria, he had discovered this Baroque music. You remember the Mozart effect that came out that Don Campbell wrote about? Absolutely. And they found out that they could develop super learning programs getting this same thing that you said when I put the headphones on my kid. And they had a whole system of super learning with Baroque music. And it's because it has a low cadence, it's very calming, and it's from the Baroque period. Bach was in this period too, but sometimes his music is too strong. But you can tell. And the best thing to start with is a Sound Health series like Advanced Brain Technologies, because they've researched it and nailed it.
So let me spin back a little bit to the.
Let me just finish one more thing.
Okay.
You see, music cuts right into the emotional brain.
There we go.
It pulls them back.
That's a nice, it's back to the center, to the second tier, that emotional brain.
Sure.
Yeah, to that, it makes the brain interactive between the three layers.
It's interesting because I remember back years ago, we were in a training and we were discussing, why do teenagers listen to like heavy bass music and rap music, and what is it like when you're sitting in your car and the windows sound like they're going to break with all that vestibular input, and the reasoning was totally correlated to where they are developmentally. That, and it's the drug of choice. Right. Yeah. It feeds the system that wants to be fed.
It numbs them mentally.
I was numb mentally like that in high school.
So when we talk about the emotional brain, what do we need to know about that on a regular basis?
Well, we can't, of course, my days are gone as parenting, but parents can really start to respond to the environment of the house. So, for instance, in the morning, we can put on, I have a favorite piece that I use from Advanced Brain called Inspiration. And that's a piece that when you have outsiders in your home, every time I play it, they say, that music is beautiful. What is it? And I've used it for kids that can't get dressed. The mothers are nagging them to eat. Come on, eat your breakfast. You got to get ready to go. And that adds anxiety into the picture. But if you play that music and the night before, figure out what you're going to have for breakfast, and the music pulls them in emotionally to calmness. And the thing about the music is it reaches parts of the brain that we can't get there by talking, touching, or giving them pictures or anything.
So is the intention...
How would a movie be? Huh?
Is the intention to move from, reptilian brain towards emotional brain to cognitive brain, or what's the intention there?
Well, what I do is I move to the midbrain with the music and see if I can get the fight or flight brain settled down without doing anything.
Because that's the great inhibitor.
Get to that emotional brain. Yeah, think about a movie. And if you watch that movie without music, would it have meaning for you?
That's a good point.
Not as much. And the other thing is the music calms, and we know that chemistry-wise, the fight or flight brain reverses the good chemistry in our body. And the calming music in the midbrain reverses that back to good. And so I just can't say enough about music. You know me. But
it's a good takeaway, especially for, like we said at the beginning, parents that are listening. Often it can be overwhelming on what can I do, or give me that's a good piece to say. Like, there's something to implement in the morning. I know with us, we've gotten kids calm in the morning, but then usually that last 5 minutes before the bus shows up, it gets,
right.
And I'm a firm believer that, even though we might not be showing it on our face, so the anxiety that can come off of adults, definitely can get the kids too.
And for instance, I've just got to say one thing about the top layer, because we're doing big damage. Say it again, big damage to our youngsters. We're depriving them of upper brain development because we're getting to the point where with these iPads and the time on the computer and all that, that's an entertainment level, isn't it? That's what I call receptive stimulation. And two things are coming out of that. One is big time addiction. The other is the lack of language development. And so if we can, let them earn a limited amount of time on their fun things, but really monitor their computer and their iPad stuff, because it's doing big, big damage. And if you talk to the CEOs of the companies today, they'll tell you, I cannot find workers that can think on the job and solve problems. And see, that's your upper brain. But what about this? What if you started telling a story while you're driving them to school, and so little kid starts the story, next kid up continues it, next kid up continues it. So then you're stimulating both listening and expressive language, which is what's going to really feed the upper brain, the problem solving. So, or you could pick songs.
Well, I think that's a great spot, Gail, to kind of wrap this one up. And it sounds to me like automatically we have an entire other podcast, at least one, just talking about what music to use and when. Because I know you well enough to know the reason that you are a big proponent of music is because it touches on all three parts of the brain. And it's a great, I say, fight or flight is a great inhibitor, then music is a great integrator. So
yes. Oh, that's the word I was looking for.
Why don't we
it's the integrator?
Can you review the three pieces that kind of pull away from this? So it would be really what? Try and integrate music at the...
We know, we want to create an environment that gives our students the most chance for decreased anxiety and calmness. And the best thing we can use as an easy tool is music. And so we want to know that the kid is behaving exactly as he should be for what's going on. And so the behavior can become our diagnosis, actually. It can tip you off to, gee, what do I need to notice? And if he can't get through that homework, because then you have to think, well, did he sleep last night? Is it this? Is it anxiety? Is it tired? You know, if it's tired, I'd say, okay, let's just work 10 minutes on 2 things. You pick them. He'll do it.
Sure.
So if they're overwhelmed, so we've got that, but the big brain that's not getting addressed is probably, like you just said, Darren, the integrator is that midbrain. And the best way to get to that is through music in your home. And it can't be hard rock. It has to be calming, musical. Mozart is, if you don't know what else to do, get Mozart.
But look, I mean, it's
Mozart,
not even the kids that'll benefit. I mean, there'll be some benefit to everyone in the home, including the parents, to have some, you know, integrate that calmness into mornings and evenings. I'm sure.
Right.
I'd take it any day of the week.
Right.
Awesome.
And I still use it because I call it phonic vitamins.
Wow.
The brain needs phonic vitamins, that upper brain. And we live in a world, I call it the Twinkie diet or the toxic sound. We can't get the right sounds because they're being drowned out by the bad sounds. And so it's like, if you eat Twinkies, you're not going to be the same person as if you get kind of a nutritious, balanced diet. And you know, they even had Twinkie, somebody killed somebody and said he couldn't help it. He was on Twinkies. And I think he got off.
So Gail, if a parent wants to find out more about the triune brain concept, where would they go?
Well, where would they go? I think it's just very simple. I mean, for instance, it was just one paragraph in Stephanie Merritt's book. John Smith addresses a lot of things about the brain and how you can affect the children through diet. So she has a book called Calming Kitchen.
Yeah, and Joan's going to be one of our guests in the coming weeks.
Great. I want people to know that you don't have to be an expert on brain diagnosis to understand the functioning brain. And so, and
that's very
when
true.
all else fails, think about music and Mozart. Mozart was proven to be the most dominant classical composer, and his music always worked and relieved depression. Yeah. And they couldn't figure out why.
Well, let's
go there next time.
Yeah, we can go down a million rabbit holes.
Well, I think music is really deserves its own time and effort, and I think
I agree.
Also know that Gail is about to publish her book. Fantastic, awesome. And she also has a parent training program that's available on the site. So we'll come back around to you, Gail, in a couple of weeks, hopefully, and we'll talk about music, and we appreciate your input on this one.
And all, as usual, all links and you know, nuggets of information will be in the show notes, so you want to make sure to check those out kind of below whatever channels you're listening on to this podcast, and make sure you go on and like,
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking me for my opinion.
We love your opinion. We're going to ask even more of it.
So much for listening to this episode of the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast with your hosts, Darren and Brian. Find them on social media at Sound Foundations for Parenting. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave a review and subscribe. And we'll catch you next time on the Sound Foundations for Parenting podcast.